Welcome everyone to this fall's installment of our Digital Humanities Speaker Series, titled The Digital Humanities and Restorative Justice Archaeology, an interview with Dr. Alicia Odewale and Dr. Brandy Thomas Wells. I'm Jennifer Borland, the Director of the Digital Humanities Initiative at Oklahoma State University. We are thrilled to be able to present this conversation digitally, highlighting Dr. Odewale's important work, and have been excited to see attendees not only from Oklahoma, but across the country. So thank you for being here. We are also excited about using the format of an interview rather than a traditional lecture, which is certain to be especially dynamic with these two compelling scholars. The Digital Humanities Initiative began in the spring of 2016 as a response to increasing interest on the part of faculty, staff, and students in various departments, the library, and other entities on campus. Our activities focus around the exchange of ideas through a wide range of events, including visiting speaker series, symposia, workshops, reading groups, and other opportunities. Our goal is to create a community of scholars and educators. Oops, sorry, I lost my window, hold on. A community of scholars and educators interested in exploring new possibilities for research and teaching. The DHI is supported by the Dean's Office of the College of Arts and Sciences, and I also want to thank Mikkel Martinelli, our GTA, for the DHI. If you would like to be added to our email list, you can contact us at humanities@okstate.edu. We also have a website that features current and past activities, and we are on Twitter, so I encourage you to follow us at OKSTATE-DH. I also want to give you a heads up with regards to our spring speaker, Dr. Moya Bailey, who we will also be hosting digitally in February. Dr. Bailey is Assistant Professor of Africana Studies and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Northeastern University. Her work focuses on marginalized groups and their use of digital media to promote social justice as acts of self-affirmation and health promotion. I'm so happy to be able to welcome you all, and I want to thank Dr. Brandy Thomas Wells for generously agreeing to lead today's discussion. Dr. Wells is an assistant professor in the Department of History here at Oklahoma State University. Her research areas include African American history and gender and women's studies. She's currently working on a book project entitled Without the Flare of Trumpets, African American Women's Search for Global Freedom. It focuses on the transnational activities of Black women's organizations in pursuit of racial and gender equality, self-determination, and peace at home and abroad. Today's event was conceived in part to coincide with the digital history course she's teaching this semester. In that class, students are working together to produce a public-facing project on the experiences of Black women in Greenwood. So Dr. Wells, I now turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for that generous introduction. Welcome everyone, and a very special welcome to Dr. Odewale. I'm very happy to be in conversation with you today. Of course, I think that this is a timely event, given that we are getting ready to commemorate the centennial of the Tulsa Race Massacre. To start, I want to thank Dr. Jennifer Borland of Oklahoma State University's Digital Humanities Initiative for her generous support of this event. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Alicia Odewale and to be in conversation with her about the digital humanities and restorative justice archaeology. Dr. Odewale comes to us from the University of Tulsa, where she is Assistant Professor of Anthropology. Her specialty within this field is African diaspora archaeology. Dr. Odewale has produced groundbreaking research on urban and rural sites of enslavement in St. Croix of the US Virgin Islands. She also researches African heritage sites in places like Arkansas, Mississippi, and of course, her home state of Oklahoma. In fact, Dr. Odewale is one of those proud hornets of the mighty Booker T. Washington High School in Tulsa. Her latest research project seeks to analyze or to reanalyze historical evidence from the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, to launch new archaeological investigations in historic Greenwood District, and to use radical mapping techniques to visualize the massacre's impact through time on the landscape of Greenwood. Dr. Odewale's exciting research has received numerous awards and support, including from the American Anthropological Association, the National Science Foundation, the Society for Historical Archaeology, and the Digital Archaeological Archive of Comparative Slavery. Dr. Odewale and her co-researcher, Parker VanValkenburgh of Brown University, are also the recipients of funding from the 1921 through 2021 Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission. Their project is entitled Mapping Historical Trauma from 1921 through 2021. And it is a multi-year project that brings together digital mapping and collaborative archaeological excavation. As part of this project, Dr. Odewale is working with TU students to construct a digital archive that brings together and makes publicly available scattered archival evidence on the Tulsa Race Massacre. That project is entitled the Greenwood Centennial Resource Collection. Dr. Odewale is the co-author of the wonderful Tulsa syllabus, along with Dr. Carla Slocum of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and two of their graduate students. Now, this Tulsa syllabus is a wonderful online resource, a guide for anyone who's seeking to understand Black history and the history of race relations in Oklahoma. Dr. Odewale launched this vital resource in June of this year as a part of her Juneteenth celebration. My students and I regularly call upon this resource in our digital methods class. And so thank you so much for that resource. So as you can imagine, it is my pleasure to have Dr. Odewale here and to be in conversation with her about her incredible work. So again, welcome, Dr. Alicia Odewale, and we'll open this up by just learning a bit more about you. Can you tell us how and when did you become interested in archaeology as a field of study?
Thank you. And thank you for that warm introduction. Starting with my origin story, I really got interested in this early on in high school at Booker T, as you mentioned, being a Hornet. We were given access to some different classwork, such as Latin, and taking Latin classes instead of the traditional languages, I became really interested in Latin, Greek, Greco-Roman history, and then I actually majored in classics in college when I got to Westminster College. So having this liberal arts background, and this interest in history and really prehistory, but how does that actually reflect people who look like me? So throughout my training in Latin and Greek and Greco-Roman history and this classical focus, I was always trying to figure out where are the brown and Black people in this story? And that element was always missing, no matter what class I'm sitting in. But then when I graduated from my bachelor's degree at Westminster College and got into graduate school, then I could actually actively pursue a degree in archaeology, and specifically with a focus on archaeology of African diaspora research, because that wasn't even a thing that I knew, first of all, people who look like me were doing. And then to be able to focus on specifically the contributions of Black people in the past and what elements and objects they leave behind, that career focus wasn't even something I was aware of until I got to graduate school.
Wow.
So,
yeah.
Yeah, so I think and that's part of my mission and the work that I do, is to make sure that people early on know that this is an option, no matter what you look like. So I know I don't, as many times when I walk into the classroom, it's the first time people are, one, being taught by a Black female, but also the first time they're seeing a Black female archaeologist. So this is a number of sort of firsts for a lot of people when I step into a classroom space or I'm out in the field and leading a project. So that's definitely something that, as I'm introducing this work to others, I'm sort of introducing them to me and the various phases of archaeology.
Oh, that's fascinating. Thank you so much for telling us about your background and how you developed this interest. When did you become interested in the Tulsa Race Massacre as a sort of scholarly topic of study?
Yeah, so the first time I actually heard about this was actually from my father. So I heard about this like just within my own family, but he didn't know a lot of the details. As many families don't know about the massive history of Greenwood. And so he framed it as more less about the massacre itself, but more about this beautiful Black mecca of just Black excellence that existed in Tulsa. And that was always something that I wanted to highlight and showcase and was proud of, to be that part of my heritage as someone who was born here in Tulsa. But having that piece, then now when I'm going into the classroom, I never heard about this until I got to high school. And it was actually my Oklahoma history teacher, Miss Barbara Coleman, who has since passed on. But she went out of her way, out of the syllabus, out of the curriculum, to make sure we knew about the Tulsa Race Massacre. And so that was kind of my first sort of in school hearing about that. And then I didn't develop a real scholarly interest in researching it for myself until I got to the stage of doing archaeology and actually looking at African diaspora archaeology in graduate school. Because for one, I was constantly sort of just perplexed as to why there had not been a sort of systematic archaeological investigation for Greenwood. And for a number of years, that was always my question of why hasn't anyone done archaeology in Greenwood to find out more about this story? And two, why is it so hard to find primary sources on this? And three, why aren't we hearing more about this in school, not just in high school, but at the college level? Because it's like
Absolutely.
after I left Booker T, I never really heard about it again in school. So it was only my independent research that I was now sort of fueled to find out more. But how do we make this more accessible for everyone across the board? And we're hearing about it, throughout our education, our educational experience, and to make it so it's more than just the massacre. It's more about this fuller several hundred years story of Greenwood and the rise of Greenwood, the destruction, the rebuilding and the redestruction and the
Absolutely.
rebuilding again. So we need to understand all of those components. So that's kind of where my interest came from. But I also have to share that and as I was learning about this and the lack of archaeology and all this, I was also doing my own genealogical research for my own family history. And I found out that in the course of my own family story, most of my family is in Tennessee and Alabama. But there was one individual who's my second great uncle. His name was Robert Ware II, and he is listed in the 1920 census as living in Tulsa, Oklahoma,
Wow.
with with grandparents. But he's the only child living with grandparents. Everyone else is back in Tennessee. So I'm still trying to find out as to one, why he was here. And he's on the roll as being 12 years old, living with grandparents and attending school. So he could have possibly attended the Dunbar School. That was one of the only grade schools that were here in Greenwood. And the address for him is listed as North Hartford. So that's definitely part of the Greenwood
Mhm.
district.
Absolutely.
But I don't have any record of him after 1920. So I literally don't know what my own connection to this history is, but am genuinely interested in finding out not just my own story, but there's so many families like mine who just literally don't know. And that's really important to be kind of diving into that. But since I didn't have the capacity to actually do any real research about this until I became faculty at TU. So I think having the capacity to actually use a lot of the archaeology that I've been doing in other spaces and bring that back home was really special. It's like a unique moment for me. But I know it's been a long time sort of in development. So my scholarly interests have been forming through time.
Yeah, thank you. That's such a fascinating history. I want to ask a question based off of the latter part of what you said. And you talked about this process and how you were able to really take this up in becoming a faculty member. So how has your past research, specifically on St. Croix, prepared you for taking up this historic and archaeological research on the Greenwood district?
Yeah, and I would love to share my screen to show some of my collaborators, because a lot of the work that I've been developing in St. Croix has been really the impetus for a lot of work that we've been building in the Virgin Islands. So, and part of that work is not just pulling together an archaeology that's community engaged, but it's actually empowering a community to make sure that we are doing something that prioritizes the next generation, prioritizes the community needs. So doing that here in St. Croix meant putting together a lot of different stakeholders, cultural leaders, organizations, and student leaders, excuse me, that have already been doing decades of labor to chronicle this history of Crucian history in the Virgin Islands, and to be cultural bearers, to sort of preserve that cultural knowledge through time. So there have been people who've been doing this work for decades, and we as archaeologists came into this space to try and offer a way to train up the next generation of Crucian archaeologists, because one of the biggest problems on island is that there was not a lot of representation in terms of indigenous or local native Virgin Islanders who were leading site interpretation. So there's not a lot of Black archaeologists or people who are actually Crucian-born archaeologists on islands. And so trying to solve that problem meant a heavy investment in training, so that once we get them into this pipeline and we start at this field school, that this will be something that can be sustainable. So they can enter this pipeline to get training in archaeology, but then they can branch out and do other things, or pursue a college degree or pursue a graduate degree, because my colleagues and I, there's 5 of us that are part of the work that I'm doing in St. Croix, and each one of us are teaching at different institutions. So 5 Black PhD archaeologists at different institutions. So students that are coming into this work now have access to 5 different institutions, and they have a connection to 5 different institutions if they wanted to pursue their degree further. So that's what makes this a pipeline to education, because we start with bringing in students at the high school level. Our youth program that Dr. Alexander Jones is the biggest leader of that part of the program. And then they also have an invitation to come back next year and teach the next cohort. So they will be paid interns when they return. So that again makes it sustainable, because now we're creating job opportunities. And that was all her idea, this genius. So then from that high school period, once they're reaching the college level, they now have access to new programs that they may not have even known about before. But then the goal is that once they graduate, they can then return to the island and then be leading that next side of Crucian archaeology. And so that's kind of the dream here. So the way that this pairs with the work I'm doing in Tulsa is that the focus is on community empowerment. The focus is on the next generation, leaving tools that the next generation can use to control their own narrative, control their own history. So that's the same problem in Greenwood. We have a lot of people that are, I'll say, using the story of Greenwood or the story of Black Wall Street for their own gains. And a lot of people who have never been to Tulsa or never experienced Greenwood, but will have a narrative about this history. And it's not the local people who have control over that narrative. And so changing that dynamic to make sure that people in Tulsa, people in a part of the Greenwood diaspora have access to their own history. They have control over it, and they are the ones leading the interpretation of this space. And so it's the same thing, even when we're in the Virgin Islands or we're in Tulsa, the same sort of problems of representation exist. And how do we shift to make sure the community has access to what they need? Oh, yeah.
Absolutely. Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. And I like how you talked about not just community engagement, but community knowledge, recognizing and working with those who are from the local community and have been doing this work, whether formally or informally, for quite some time. Can you talk about how your commitment to community empowerment influenced your work on the Tulsa, the Tulsa syllabus? What is
Oh,
the
yeah.
impetus of that project?
Yeah, so the Tulsa syllabus was a bit different in terms of this is not an archaeology project. So this was my kind of first foray in the digital humanities space. But partnering with a cultural anthropologist, Carla Slocum, that was a beautiful partnership because she is more versed in this world and had more of a, I'll say a broader picture of what the Black experience in Oklahoma was like because she's been writing about this history of all Black towns in Oklahoma and Black heritage in Oklahoma in general. And so I'm coming at this from an archaeological perspective, but she's coming at this from a cultural anthropology perspective. So the two of us together really make it so we are, again, placing the community, placing that the cultural knowledge that's gained from community, that's the primary. And the Tulsa syllabus, the real launching point here was the fact that whenever we had not only Watchmen, but the announcement that there was going to be a new search for mass graves, and then Trump coming to visit, and then all these things were happening and unfolding in Tulsa at the same time. And so there was national news around Tulsa, but then again, you have so much of the story shifting depending on who's telling it. And a lot of misinformation about what the massacre was or what Greenwood is. And I kept getting a lot of calls, emails, and all things to try and lend my expertise or my opinion to Tulsa's history. And a lot of people, the biggest question I would get was, how did this happen? How did this massacre happen? Especially the people who were seeing Watchmen for the first time, just hearing about this and could not understand how this had happened or why it's not widely known. So there's that part of it. In answering that question, this resource developed as a way for people to have an entry point, an entry point into understanding this story, and not just the massacre, but to understand the context of the Black experience, not just in Tulsa, but in Oklahoma itself. So we focus on, again, not just trying to give you this exhaustive list of sources, but to make sure that even if you don't have time for reading a full book, that you can listen to a podcast. You can listen to an album, a musical album. You can read an op-ed piece. So there are multiple sort of media that are being put together here. I'm just gonna show this. So if you go to the website, here, Tulsa syllabus. This will give you the resource, but to explain what Tulsa syllabus is, we're explaining not just the massacre again. This is a more context-driven understanding of the rise, destruction, and rebuilding of the Greenwood District. And as we're walking through this, the reason why I put this together at the start was because I was planning on teaching in Oklahoma the archaeology of Black heritage in Oklahoma. That's a class I'm going to be teaching in the fall. But instead of creating the syllabus and keeping it to myself for a few students at TU, I decided to share it with the world. And this resource is now something that a lot of people are using, but this is not meant to be an exhaustive list. This is meant to be an entry point for people, no matter where your understanding of Greenwood is. If you are just hearing about Tulsa for the first time in your life, this resource will give you access to at least a list of books to read, some podcasts to listen to, op-ed pieces, reports that have been done as the mass graves survey is unfolding. There's a lot of different sort of media you can soak up from this and at different levels.
Absolutely. It's an amazing resource, and it's going to be important, not just in the year ahead, but I think many years to come. Again, it's one that my students and I continuously go back to, and it's so important to have a sort of central place because, as you talk about in your research, people have to go sort of everywhere to look up information on Tulsa, on Greenwood, right? And then they have to sort of decipher for themselves the legitimacy of
Yes.
of those sources. So yeah, thank you again.
And I did want to just share that whenever we were listing these sources, we did list primarily those that were Black local authors, and really want to highlight those sources as voices that need to be amplified.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'd like to shift a little bit and learn a bit more about your mapping historical trauma in Tulsa from 1921 through 2021 project. Can you tell us about the aims of that work and how does it bring together archaeology, restorative justice, and the digital humanities?
Yes, yes. So I'm actually going to start sharing again. So this project, Mapping Historical Trauma in Tulsa from 1921 to 2021, this was the connection between Parker VanValkenburgh and myself, but funded by the Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission, as you mentioned. And so I don't think a lot of people understand this commission is made up of volunteers. They're not getting paid to do this. So they are really a board of community members themselves. There are educators, there are activists, there are descendants, there are political servants that are all part of this work. And whenever we created this, we are acknowledging that this is a number of firsts. So one of them is that this is the first systematic archaeological investigation of the historic Greenwood district. And we are focused primarily on the business districts within Greenwood, because there was a whole residential side that we may get to cover later, but we have to start somewhere. It's expansive. So if you think about historic Greenwood, you're thinking about 10,000 possible residents. So we can't even begin to try and cover it all. So starting with that point, this is a really important part for us, that we have this autoarchaeology focus. And I explained this in a recent talk that I did before with Rice University, that this autoarchaeology focus is important because now we have people who are both, who carry this dual identity of both archaeologists and community member, descendant. So there's a lot of people who are having all of these identities together, who are now leading research in their own backyards, essentially, our own hometown. So this is different than doing a traditional archaeological research project, because this is a grassroots. This is something that was led by the community, funded by the community, and is led by people who are on both sides of the fence, are part of the community, part of this familiar history, but they have been trained in archaeological research. So it's everyone's like part of this work together. It's more collaborative, it's more democratic, and it's more engaging in a different way than I've had experience before. And to think about the scope, as you mentioned, we've got digital mapping, we have the re-examination of our archival resources, and the excavations planned. And so all of this together, both the digital humanities and the archaeology, is something we have to pull together over 4 years. So I mentioned this project is a 4-year project initially, but we're seeing that as kind of phase 1. So when 2021 comes around, we're not going to, check a box and move on. The work will continue, but we'll probably seek additional funding from another source. So a main theme for us here for this work is restorative justice. And with restorative justice, our goal is to be able to give tools back to the community for them to use before we're doing any sort of additional research for our own purposes. So the goal should be to give something back to the community before you are doing your own sort of and archaeology itself is somewhat destructive. So we have to acknowledge that and be more intentional about giving back and restoring our community before we're digging into it. So that's a big piece of what we do. So the first thing was to, just as you mentioned, just to try and get to that problem of access to history, and try and get to the problem of the scattering of this database and the scattering of the archives. We initially started with the building of the Greenwood Centennial Resource Collection, because before we even start to dig into this community of Greenwood, we want to at least get our arms around what are the archival spaces that exist right now? What are the collections that exist right now, and where are they? So documenting where all the Tulsa Race Massacre collections are in the country was a big goal at the start. And not just to document where they are, but to document the levels of access. So what collections are actually digitally accessible? What collections are, you can only visit at in person at certain hours, or is closed to the public, or any other numbers of levels of access that could be part of this work. But first of all, just having people have a tool where they know where to go for information. They know what collections are existing, they know where it's located, and they know the levels of access they can gain from that. And so that's a lot of the maps and photographs and newspaper clippings and even the recorded oral testimony. We can then put all that primary data into a Greenwood historical webGIS. And so this is like the most labor intensive part of the work we're doing, is to build this webGIS map. So this is a virtual map. It'll be online for people to use. And what's beautiful about this is that we can literally map the footprint of the historic Greenwood district through time. So you can see the impact of the massacre on the footprint of the landscape. And so what that looks like is literally a shrinking of this community on the landscape, and then rebuilding, and then another shrinking with urban renewal, and then another period of rebuilding. So, I mean, you can see the phases of Greenwood unfolding. The footprint is a moving target, but we can at least reimagine what that footprint looks like, instead of its sort of shrunken entity today, and be able to use the materials that we were just talking about with the Greenwood Centennial Resource Collection. Those primary data, we can embed into that webGIS map, so that people are, as they're clicking on structures, as they're clicking on features around the city and the landscape, whatever we know about that structure will come up at the same time. So any documents, any photographs, any other evidence that's relational to that space would come up at the same time. And so it'll be a searchable tool that people can use. And that means not just, again, not trying to control how people use this, but literally giving people tools for them to draw conclusions, draw meaning for themselves, investigate this history for themselves. And that's part of, again, placing that control in the hands of local people, the people that are part of this Greenwood diaspora. And then the surveys come in, the archaeology really comes into this, because we're searching for signs of life. So for this project, what really makes our project distinct from the mass grave survey is that we're actively looking for structural survival, the remnants of buildings, the remnants of built Greenwood, not just, even though it's highly important to look for the lost loved ones that have been murdered, that have been lost. This project is looking for these signs of community gathering spaces, the signs of even finding evidence of structures being burned to the ground, community being burned to the ground. We also want to have that same story be part of the rebuilding process. So that creating a whole project around signs of life is important for us. So we have both sides of the story, not just a damage narrative, not just a story of violence and destruction, but a story of resilience through time for Greenwood. And that's a bigger focus for us beyond the massacre. And to talk about critical sites of memory. And so these critical sites of memory are really special because, as I told you, the story of Greenwood keeps shifting depending on who's telling it. But when you have critical sites of memory, it anchors the story so that you have specific structures, specific places, specific times where you can literally anchor the retelling of this, so it's less able to be co-opted by others. It's less able to be shifted and manipulated, because you have a specific sort of understanding of time and structural elements that are there on the landscape, marked, that are less able to change. And the last thing that really makes this project stand out is its future applications, because as both Parker and myself, we're both academics, we're both educators. Our main future application is that this be something that can be used in the classroom and outside of the classroom as tools of educational training. And so what we're really trying to do is create communities of practice. And so with these communities of practice, that means not only the tools that we're developing be handed out to the community, but the knowledge that's gained from just using these tools will be passed down from generation to generation. So now we have these active communities that are engaged in the telling and the retelling of their own history. they have control and access to their own historical resources, and they have new knowledge that's being developed from within that keeps being passed down. And so that's what makes these organic sort of communities of practice work. And that's what we really are hoping for with this whole project, to have the Centennial Resource Collection come together, the map, the archaeology, all be used to create these communities of practice.
That is a transformative project. It's really going to change the way that we think about historic Greenwood and also the Tulsa Race Massacre. And as you said, these sort of signs of life. In your research and in several of your talks, you've talked about restorative justice and its significance. Can you tell us a bit today why restorative justice is so important for the city of Tulsa?
Oh, that's a great question. So restorative justice has a number of different roles for us, but for Tulsa specifically, it has an even more important sort of perspective, because there's kind of two sides to this: restorative and retributive justice.
Mm-hmm.
So restorative justice is really focused on historical trauma and the healing from historical trauma, acknowledging that this trauma exists and lingers today, and what are the impacts of that, and trying to find a way to move forward from this historical trauma. The retributive justice acknowledges that same historical trauma, but focuses on the who, what, when, where, why, to try and hold others accountable for that action, for that damage, for that violence. And so comparing the two projects, the mapping historical trauma and the mass grave search, the mass grave search is more of a retributive justice project, because they are treating this as a homicide, even if the homicide happened 100 years ago. And that the process is to really sort of dive into this crime, while the mapping historical trauma project is really focused on how do we search for the signs that people rebuilt here, people still live here, and people continue to struggle for essential resources in the North Tulsa community. How do we pair the present day conditions with the past and connect that historical trauma together? So it's a different sort of lens, but they're both vitally important. We need both sides of that justice.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Well, I want to open it up for other people to ask you questions about your research. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you for asking those wonderful questions.
Thank you. That was wonderful. I am going to pop back in here and play a role of Q&A facilitator. So the first question that we have, and I want to encourage everyone who's an attendee to use the Q&A portal to ask questions. And I will attempt to address those as they come. But the first question was about some of these resources that you're developing and when they will be available or publicly available. So specifically, the question is about the Greenwood Centennial Resource Collection. But maybe you also want to kind of address that question more broadly in terms of the whole Mapping Historical Trauma in Tulsa project.
Yeah, so we are going to be very intentional about the launch of these resources, that they'll be launched sort of internally first. And again, since the primary sort of placement, again, is to put tools in the hands of both youth, educators, people in Greenwood who are part of this diaspora, it's going to be released to them first. And it's not available online yet, but our plan is to, over the next 4 years, again, reveal this. Not every single one of these digital resources will be publicly available, but they will be sort of released in stages, so that, again, the community maintains access and control over the resources. So that's kind of primary for us. And so being intentional about that release is part of that, but to also make sure that these are living databases. So even once they're released, they're still going to be actively being updated, maintained. Other people will be informing that work, giving us feedback, and helping us sort of make sure that we have a lot of these narratives sort of coexisting. There's not just one narrative being presented in the site. So there's going to be a lot of changes even once it's out.
Thank you. And I just want to say, Dr. Wells, if you want to follow up on any of these questions or connect them to anything, feel free.
Thank you.
Okay, we have another one. So this question is about the term local history. Sometimes the term local history is framed as a negative or less important form of history within the professional historical field. Can you speak to why keeping local control of histories and narratives is so important?
Ooh, that's a really good question. And I should frame that I am not a historian, I'm an archaeologist. So if you ask an archaeologist, they might give you a different answer. But for me, it's important because, again, I am a Tulsan. So I've seen how just modified, co-opted, and all the different fake news that is part of the story of Greenwood, and being frustrated by that myself. And so being an archaeologist now in this space, it's different because I want the oral histories, the written histories, the archaeology, the land-based data to all coexist together. And so there's no reason to be ranking these ways of knowing about the world as one is more important or more valid than the other. They all could be ways of knowing about the world. And just because it wasn't written down doesn't make it any less true. And so having those oral recorded testimonies from survivors of the massacre coexist with the archaeology we're doing now, coexist with the written testimonies. All of this could be part, and the secondary scholarship, the books that have been written for decades, all of this should be part of our local history and should be, valued on the same plane and really be informing one another. So we've been actively using our Sanborn maps and our oral histories to better understand where we should be digging. So I mean, it's literally all of it should be used together to get a better picture of what Greenwood is and what it was.
Yeah, absolutely. And as a historian, to talk about the significance of local history and local voices and local experiences, we can think about sort of national narratives and how they flatten or how they
Mm-hmm.
can flatten, just how dynamic events are that happen, right? So they focus on a salient figure, and perhaps other people are left behind. And sometimes those other people tend to be women, right? Or people who are
Absolutely.
working class, those sort of things. And so it is important to have that local history so that we can really understand the history that occurred, but also the history that was experienced by the people who lived there, right? So it amplifies their voices, and it really makes clear that they are legitimate authorities on their own experience. And so to Dr. Odewale's point, we're not saying get rid of non-local histories. What she has argued is that there needs to be an emphasis on local voices and also on the experiences and the writings of people of color, of Black authors. And so we have to make space for that. And what it does is it presents a really dynamic history.
Absolutely. Multi-vocality is what I really advocate for. We can't
Absolutely.
have one privileged narrative of truth just exist out there.
Absolutely.
Excellent, thank you. That was a wonderful response. More questions. This is a question that actually was posed in the course of registration as well. So I wanna bump this question up. Are there opportunities for students from Oklahoma, Oklahoma State, or other local universities to assist with these projects? So are you looking for, sort of labor on any of these projects that that we can direct students and other members of the community to help with?
So we're still trying to make that work in terms of COVID. So before COVID,
Right.
this was designed to be a completely collaborative research project. So we would invite our descendants out, we would invite community members out, we invite our students out together, both for the surveys and for the excavations and for the research of the archives. So it was meant to do all that. But now we've had to really shift our focus. And as we're focusing on the digital researching, there's a couple people that are like actively in isolation doing work to help us, but we're trying to see how once we get to 2021 and we're doing the actual excavations, how we can make that more open but still safe for everyone to be able to be part of the excavation process. So the answer is yes and no, because we're still trying to actively make a plan to make it as open as possible without endangering anyone in this process. But
And
right now, we already do have some students working with us.
Are they primarily TU students or?
They're primarily TU students, but we have a number of folks who are like at every, so with the Greenwood Resource Collection, we have to really partner with every one of our institutions that are part of, that they have collections related to Tulsa Race Massacre history, and they are by themselves sort of chronicling what they have and taking an inventory of what they have and then sharing the object reports with us. So it doesn't happen with just us. Every one of these institutions have been trying to digitize their research, trying to take an inventory of what they have, and then try and share that with us. So it's been very collaborative, and there are students involved in like each of these institutions as internships, as collections care assistants, as all these different sort of entities. So it's definitely not just myself and my students.
All right, great, thank you. Okay, next question. I'm excited about the emphasis on community empowerment and capacity building as it promises a powerful inversion of power and authority. As you've built this project, how have you described this priority to community members and academic scholars accustomed to holding power and authority?
Ooh, that's a good question. Thank you, Brian, for asking that. It is a power shift. It is literally a power shift. And for one, it starts with the funding, because usually archaeological research is funded by a national agency like NSF or Winter Grant or all these other spaces, and not the funding does usually come from within the community. And so having the Centennial Commission take on the role of fundraising for us to completely fund this research, and then they are the ones that are our governing body. They're the ones we're actually reporting our research to. It kind of removes this sort of third-party governing of sort of formal control over the project, because now we're really collaborating with a community entity to not only work as our funders, they're our governing body, they're our stakeholders, they're the people we're working with, laboring with. So it's a complete power shift. So to communicate this to others, this is something we're trying to develop as a model. A model of not just community engagement, but what does restorative justice archaeology actually look like, and as well as an archaeology of redress. And so that's a new form of sort of archaeology that's been rooted in a lot of indigenous archaeology research that we're seeing as something that can be a model going forward, that other people we would love our scholars and our colleagues to be replicating. But it really starts with acknowledging that you yourself as an archaeologist are coming into this space with a certain positionality, certain biases, certain identities, that you definitely need to have a lot more people at the table to really have a conversation about what does community empowerment look like, and not just you coming in and saying, this is the research I'm going to do. I'm going to do it for you instead of with you. But to really have the courage to come into a space and not have a finished project, to not have a site all picked out, to not have a research question, to not even have funding, but to just say, how can I use archaeology in my training to help you as a community? And so that's really what happened with the Centennial Commission. They came to us and asked, what would an archaeology project would look like? We developed the budget together, we developed a community engagement plan together, and we literally made this project fit in alongside all the other planned events for the Centennial. And so this is kind of living alongside all the other work that's already happening in Greenwood, and not, me as an external researcher coming in and deciding I'm going to do this at this site. And if I have no connection to this history of the community, it looks completely different.
Thank you.
Hope that
Okay.
answers your question.
That was a dynamic question.
Firing these questions at you. Although this is a challenging one. How do you separate yourself from the emotional trauma of the Tulsa Race Massacre? As someone who gets very emotional very fast while learning about these types of histories, I would like to know how you keep yourself from adopting or feeling the emotional trauma created by these horrible events.
That's a really, really important question. And I would say that for me, one of my biggest goals is to not do more trauma unto people as I'm uncovering historical trauma myself. So trying to make sure that as I am doing this work, I understand that both the damage, the emotion, and the work is layered. So it's not just about what happened in 1921, but that trauma still lingers for our community, and my own understanding of it is layered. And so it's not just again trying to break down access to us, barriers to access in the archives, but to acknowledge that we've had a scattering of people, archives, space, the reclaiming of land, the encroachment of land, and the lack of protection around Greenwood as a historical district. I mean, there's a lot of layered sort of trauma that need to be unpacked there, as well as psychological trauma. But for myself, what I do to try and navigate all this is to make sure, one, that I'm not trying to place myself as an authority on all things with the Tulsa Race Massacre, that I acknowledge that I am learning as I'm going through this. And there's a lot of work that I'm doing to make sure that as I'm citing sources, that I'm reading, that one, I'm taking breaks. Mental breaks are very important, but to make sure that our descendant voices are placed first before my own sort of research and citations and understanding. So it's like, of course, put the elders first in the conversation, put our Black voices first in the conversation, and then make sure that uh, in my own emotions, I'm trying to acknowledge my own biases in this work, acknowledge myself as, as I said, that dual identity. And so shifting between that dual identity is important. And as you do these kind of histories, and I've actually been doing this kind of work for a long time, beyond the Tulsa Race Massacre, my earlier research in the Virgin Islands was primarily based with slave narratives. So trying to place our narrative voices ahead of everything else, it kind of gives people a voice, gives people honor and dignity who were denied that in life. And so that helps me and gives me hope and gives me a way to sort of, again, give something back that helps my own mental state. Because now I'm letting the research speak, and the objects speak as well, the artifacts speak, before I am now inserting my own interpretation. So that's important for me.
Thank you. Okay, next question has to do with the challenges of sustainability for projects like this in terms of their digital components. So not only is that kind of an issue for most digital humanities projects, but maybe pronounced especially in the way that this is bringing so many different things together, and there's so many levels and components to this project, and it's ongoing. It doesn't have a finite end, right? So what are maybe some of the things that you've had to deal with to kind of figure that all out?
Yeah, we're still actively answering that question, the sustainability of this work, because we want it to exist for another 100 years. So this is not something that it's going to be beyond my lifetime, that hopefully it will exist in a virtual space. But this is something that is unfolding as the community is deciding how they want the web tools to actually look. What questions do they want to be able to answer with these digital tools? And so all of those questions are being answered as we are discussing with the community. We're going to have another community meeting in December to literally ask some of these questions and get their perspective. And so we are not right now deciding all of these sort of sustainability questions. We are letting the community decide what they would like to see happen here, and where would they like to have it hosted. What does that look like? How much does that cost? And what level can we maybe make sure that we have that transparency and access, but to make sure that the data is safe and backed up. And so all of these things are unfolding as the community is again in the driver's seat.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, how do you protect archaeological sites when they are in an urban environment, particularly one near a river that's prone to flooding?
Oh man, Sarah's got a problem on her hands. Okay, I may get technical for a minute, but for urban archaeologists, and again, my site in the Virgin Islands was an urban site of enslavement, which is already a rare sort of discussion to have around what does slavery look like in an urban setting. But to take that same urban perspective and place it in Tulsa, Tulsa has a unique case in that there's been several periods of destruction that have been happening and several periods of reconstruction. But when you're near a fluvial environment, as we call it, there is constant need for doing salvage archaeology. And so in a context like that, when you're in an urban environment, you unfortunately have a lot of salvage work to do, and often a lot of looting. So there's there's a lot of different things that can happen with that, but to protect an archaeological site, the best resource that we have is ARPA, our legal document with RHPA, and even the Historical Sites Act and these other sort of legal standardized really federal laws that are in place to protect cultural resources are our best protection for archaeological sites. And so there's a sort of federal legal way to go about protecting a space, but there's also community-led action that's usually happening with activism around a space. So one of those programs is Historic Sites That Matter. Arkansas has been really leading that initiative. And there's a couple others that I'm forgetting now, but there's a number of ways that you can protect this at a federal level, a community level, and then you as an archaeologist deciding, okay, I'm going to do work here and apply for permits to protect this myself, or bring awareness to the space as me as an independent researcher can do that. So there's different levels of protection you can offer a space, but sometimes that salvage archaeology is really all you can do. So I don't know what state you're in, but you might want to partner with your SHPO, your State Historical Preservation Office, to see what kind of protections could be put in place for this site.
Great.
Or your TIPO if it's on tribal land.
Thank you. Okay, we have a couple. I don't know if we'll get to both of them, but I'm going to ask this last question first, I think. What is unique about using archaeology as a form of restorative justice? I'll admit that when we were putting this together, those phrases together was a new thing to me. So, I mean, partly because I'm not in the field, but I was really intrigued by the segue of those different concepts. And so if you could talk a little bit more about how kind of bringing archaeology into that conversation is a new thing.
Yeah, so this, and I should say that restorative justice archaeology, I did not come up with that term. People have been doing this sort of work, and it's been in a indigenous archaeology context for a long time. And Dr. Ship Colwell Chanthapone is one of the biggest proponents of that work. What I did is really add to what I thought the definition of restorative justice archaeology is, and then apply it to a unique population in Tulsa and what that work means in Tulsa. And so it kind of like shifts away from a theoretical framework to a methodology that can be used in other areas. And so people usually think of social justice as policy change, reform in terms of police brutality, in terms of our judicial system, and a whole bunch of other problems that need to be solved in our communities. But taking those same issues that a community is facing and adding a land-based component, there is a need to reclaim space, to reclaim not only our landscape, but also the knowledge that's been driven by this community, the heritage around this space. And so trying to restore not just land, not just resources and policies and everything else that needs to be redressed in this work, archaeology comes in as a way to add to the story, as a way to add empirical data to maybe a oral account, as a way to point to this happened here, and we can literally put this on a landscape and talk about it in a different way than an oral testimony may talk about it. So for some people that makes it more real, but as I've argued, there's no way to rank these ways of knowing. They should just be adding on and enhancing our understanding. So for me, archaeology is an essential part of restorative justice, because this is what a lot of people recognize in the court systems, unfortunately. This is what a lot of people are clinging to as sort of more tangible evidence, even though for me, both the tangible and intangible are still all valid evidence. So it's a part of this larger work.
Yes, thank you. How do you guys feel about fielding one more quick question before, even though we're at 1 o'clock?
That's fine.
You got one more quick one? Okay. So I understand some people might need to head off, but we're gonna put this out there, which is just sort of a question about popular culture, maybe the Watchmen in particular, but kind of in general. The Tulsa Race Massacre has come up a lot in popular culture in the last few months, and they're wondering about whether that feels like a portrayal that is positive or negative, and how it might connect to supporting kind of a local perspective on those events?
Okay, so I am not the biggest fan of Watchmen, but that is my personal opinion. I'm not speaking for my institution or anyone else. Uh, but I think that it has value, and that it brings awareness to a whole nother generation and a whole nother group of the nation who were never aware of this before. And that visualization of what happened was very dramatic, and uh, really made it, I think, sit in people's minds in a different way than hearing a narrative or reading about it in a book, that for some people made you want to know more. And so that's the point where I think had value, that people saw that and wanted to know more. And then even though it had some issues in terms of its representation, I thought that the inclusion of one, I know that the director was heavily reading Tim Madigan's book, The Burning, at the time this was created. So having that rooted in some scholarship, even though Tim Madigan is not a local scholar, it has some value. And then having that sort of image be broadcast across HBO, that's something that I never foresaw. But I do think it has value. I won't say if it's positive or negative, but I think that that representation should coexist with our local histories and local understanding, and really be a good point of, again, wanting to know more, an entry point into this history. So pop culture works in bringing awareness and bringing people into the conversation who weren't there before.
Absolutely. And I would just echo Dr. Odewale's point. I have sort of conflicting or multi-layered
yes.
thoughts about the Watchmen. But even in talking to my students, it really was the entry point for a lot of people to learn a bit more about the Tulsa Race Massacre. But as we get ready to wrap up, one of the sort of pieces of encouragement that I would offer for all of those who watch that piece or know others who will watch it or have watched it is to point them back to Dr. Odewale's Tulsa syllabus, right? And so don't let that be the only thing that you think you know about the Tulsa Race Massacre. Read different histories, watch different documentaries, but also look at Dr. Odewale's research as it unfolds over the next few years. And so again, don't let that be your only resource for knowing about the Tulsa Race Massacre, about historic Greenwood, but also just about African Americans in Oklahoma.
Yes, thank you for that.
I think that's an excellent conclusion. Do either of you want to say any final remarks, or should we?
Well, I've enjoyed this. I enjoyed the conversation, Dr. Odewale. Thank you so much for being here with us. I think we learned a great deal about restorative justice, about archaeology, and we are really looking forward to your research as it continues to unfold, and really appreciate your emphasis on not just community knowledge and engagement, but community empowerment.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to speak, and all of you who took time out of your day to come and sit for this talk. It's a wonderful conversation, and thank you for your questions, Brandy.
My pleasure. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. And I just want to mention that we will eventually have a recording of this that we can share. So I'll plan on sending it to everyone who registered and getting it out in various networks so that even more people can be part of this conversation. Thank you, everyone.